Well, good morning. It's so good to be back with you all. As I came in here last night, just to make sure things were ready for today, just like this sense of being home. Just like I feel like this is where I'm supposed to be, and not like here, but like with you all. It's just so good to be back home. We had a great vacation. I got to chip away a little bit at our mama's boy, which I think Lauren's thankful for, and I really am too. Um, a few things on the bulletin. Kirby already drew our attention to it, but next week we're going to go see George and Marion Amos. The Springs at Stony Brook. It's a residential facility where they care for people who have needs, assisted living needs, and they have some residents there who are going to join us along with George and Marion. And I know they are really looking forward to that. And so if you're available, next Sunday, 2 o'clock, we'll meet at the Springs at Stony Brook, and we'll have a period of devotion. We'll take our songbooks and sing songs. We'll offer the Lord's Supper with George and Marion. I know they're really looking forward to that, so I hope you'll be there. And there's a couple other things as well. Jessica has been organizing and coordinating and planning a family Bible day. It's going to be July 18th for all of our children, for their parents, for all of our children's friends. It should be a great day. So I hope you'll be here for that as well. And then in August, we have our annual singing coming up, August 7th. And the day after that, August 8th, we'll meet at Virginia and Robbins Clubhouse, and we'll have a blitz study with Brian Nash as we go through questions that the psalmists repeatedly pose that really resonate with us. Questions like, God, why have you forsaken me? Or God, how long? Or God, why are you delaying? Questions that will really resonate with us. Brian's going to walk us through some different questions from the Psalms. Plan on those things. They'll be in the bulletin, but put those on your calendar. Make efforts to be here with us for those days. I'm going to forget something. I know that I am, so I'm just going to get into the message. I want you to imagine something with me. I want you to imagine a museum. It's a museum that's unlike any you've ever been to. This is not a museum that displays items people have carefully preserved. This is a museum who displays items that people have lost. So there's a wedding ring that once symbolized someone's unbreakable bond. It was found on a beach, and now it sits on this display shelf. There's a loved on and worn out stuffed animal that once comforted a child every night that they slept. Well, it was left behind at a train station, and now it sits in this display box. There's a weathered photograph that's folded and faded, separated from that person that clearly carried it for so long. A violin case with these odd notches along the top of the instrument case. A set of keys. Every item in that museum has a history. Every item comes with its own unique story, and every one of these items appear to have mattered significantly to someone at one point. They all appear to have been unintentionally lost. Like it wasn't somebody left this behind, but they forgot it. They misplaced it. They became distracted. They became busy. They became preoccupied. And this thing that was once cherished it slipped away unnoticed. You know, we lose things that are unimportant all the time. At least I do. And it's no big deal. But when you lose something that is precious and valuable, it's a little more sobering. When it's something that you lose that you don't think you can go on without. Deuteronomy, if you want to turn there with me. Deuteronomy chapter 1. We're going to open up the book of Deuteronomy this morning. And this is Moses' sermon. This is Moses' sermon about the precious thing God is giving his people. Deuteronomy chapter 1. It opens in the plains of Moab. So this is just on the other side of the Jordan River, opposite the city of Jericho. That's where the last verse of Numbers left off. If you're there, just look at the last verse of Numbers, right before the first verse of Deuteronomy. We're in the plains of Moab, just on the other side of the Jordan River, opposite the city of Jericho. This is the last place Israel camps before they come into the promised land. This is the place Balak summoned Balaam to curse Israel. The wilderness journey, it's nearly over. The Jordan River lies ahead. The promised land is visible on the horizon. In Numbers, when we were there a few weeks ago, it leaves off what seems like Moses fading from prominence. And there's a new leader that God's been working with behind the scenes for a long time. And this new leader is commissioned in front of all the people. Joshua is commissioned as the next leader of God's people. But not so fast. Moses has some more words he wants to say before we move forward. Moses has this final farewell sermon. We call it Deuteronomy. I want us to think about how this sermon would function in the hearts of the generation Moses is preaching to. Because Moses is not preaching to the generation from Exodus. Moses is preaching to their children. Children, a generation that didn't walk through the sea. They've heard about it. I'm sure they've heard a lot about it, but they didn't witness it themselves. They didn't witness it firsthand. They know the details. They know about Egypt. They know about Pharaoh. They know about the plagues. They've heard about the walls of water standing on either side of God's people as they move across the Red Sea. But there's a big difference between hearing the testimony of somebody who witnessed that firsthand and then witnessing deliverance for yourself. That is the challenge facing this generation that Moses is preaching to. The challenge isn't whether God's acted in the past. The challenge is whether these memories from the past can in some way shape my personal faith. Can the details, the acts of God that others have witnessed before us become convictions that we ourselves carry about the God who's acted in the past? Can we remember over and over, constantly, what we've never personally experienced firsthand? Every generation faces this challenge. No generation gets to stand on someone else's testimony for long. Like your grandparents may have had remarkable faith. Your parents may have seen God's answer to prayers in extraordinary ways, God's provision, God's protection, God's faithfulness. But eventually, every generation arrives at this same crossroads. The truths of God that we've inherited, they must become our own personal convictions that we have personally embraced. At some point, faith has to move from God did this for them to God is so real to me. And that transition is one of the most important transitions in our spiritual life. Moses is standing before this generation that is about to inherit a promise. And what he desperately wants for them is to inherit the faith that goes along with this promise. That's the challenge Moses is addressing. What they've been witnessing, what this generation Moses is preaching to, what they've been witnessing is a generation that didn't do so well in the wilderness. And I'm not trying to be harsh on them, but room for improvement, right? Like the rest of us, there's definitely room for improvement. So Moses has a lot to say before they move forward. They are about to inherit something so precious. And Moses doesn't want what God is about to give them to end up in that museum of people's lost precious things. So what exactly is Moses afraid they might lose? At first glance, it might seem like he's worried they might lose the promise, or they might lose the inheritance, they might lose the land, or they might lose this future God's promised them. But as Moses continues preaching, it becomes clear that's not his greatest concern. Like they're standing on the edge of the promised land. It's right there. That land isn't slipping away. The real danger is they might enter this land and forget the God who's given it to them. Moses isn't primarily worried they're going to lose the gift. He's worried they'll enjoy this gift so much they'll forget the giver of the gift. So Moses spends the first 5 chapters of Deuteronomy preaching something kind of repetitive. Everything that's just happened in Numbers, he tells them again. And you can kind of scan through chapters 1, 2, 3 and see this. He revisits Kadesh Barnea. He revisits the 12 spies. He revisits the rebellion. He revisits the wandering. He revisits Sinai and the covenant and the 10 commandments. Why does he do this? Why does he keep going back? I think Moses understands something that maybe every parent and every teacher, and maybe for all of those who preach, something we need to come to grips with. People need reminding, and people need reminding a lot. The generation before them, the generation that perished in the wilderness, they didn't perish because they lacked evidence. They perished because they stopped trusting the God that they knew. And so now Israel, this new generation, stands on the edge of abundance, on the edge of rich blessing and inheritance. The wilderness is almost over. The manna is about to stop. There's permanent homes that await them, fields and vineyards and stability. God is about to hand them. And Moses is really concerned. He's deeply concerned. And he's concerned about something that sounds unusual at first. He's not worried about giants or fortified cities. He's not worried about military defeat or famine or drought or enemies. Moses is concerned that Israel will succeed. That's his greatest concern. Israel's success. And it sounds backwards, but Moses is concerned about their success because prosperity has a way of changing the questions that people ask. In the wilderness, what do you think the generation who wandered in the wilderness, the generation who walked through the Red Sea, what do you think they woke up every morning thinking about? Whew, if God's not here today, we're not going to make it. If God's not here, if he's not with us in this, we're not going to survive. We need God here with us today. Will God provide today? But this next generation, they're going to wake up in this land of blessing and abundance. And they might wake up asking, what should I do with everything God's given me? It's a very different question to wake up with. The danger is that this success can remove the sense of urgency that once drove their dependence. And it's not because God has changed in any way, but it's because our comfort can dull our awareness to God's presence. We often imagine spiritual danger arriving through catastrophe. And Moses imagines this spiritual danger arriving through convenience, through ordinary routines, through full cupboards and stable careers and predictable paychecks, through years where nothing seems dramatically wrong. And these things aren't bad. These are all blessings. But blessings have this strange ability to become invisible when we live with those blessings long enough. You know, a lot of us might suppose that the hard times are the greatest threats to our faith. We might imagine that suffering is what causes people to abandon God. Persecution and pain and loss and disappointment. And certainly those things are tremendous tests to our faith. But Moses has spent 40 years watching these people, and he knows something about their hearts. Sometimes suffering drives people towards God, and sometimes abundance and prosperity causes us to pull away from him. Think about Israel's story. When they were trapped, when they're trapped in that moment between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army, what do you think they were thinking about? What were they calling out for? They're calling out for God and his help. When they're hungry in the wilderness, when they're thirsty in the plains of Moab, where do you think their mind is going? How desperately we need God in this moment. If we're going to survive, God has to show up. Need has a way of making God's presence so obvious. But what happens when you have a house and when your pantry's full and the crops have come in and the children are healthy and doing pretty well and life is a little more stable and there's no pressing emergency? That's the question Moses is wrestling with concerning this generation. And it's probably the question that's most relevant to us in our culture. Most of us know how to pray when life starts falling apart, when we're in pain, when we're desperate, when we're in need. The challenge is learning how to have that same disposition when things are going pretty well. The challenge is learning how to remember God with that sense of urgency, with that sense of need, with that sense of dependence, when nothing seems obviously wrong. So that's where Moses takes us in chapter 6. We're going to pick up in chapter 6. If remembering God is the great challenge facing Israel, Moses begins exactly where we would expect. He begins with worship. Moses knows that Israel must learn how to love the Lord before they learn how to possess this land. And God's greatest concern was never simply like where his people lived on the coordinates of this planet. His greatest concern is who has possession of his people's hearts. That's the greatest concern. Who has possession of his people's hearts? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So the first thing he starts with is Shema, the Shema, the centerpiece of Israel's confession. That first word, hear, is what we translate as Shema. Listen, tune into this. You have to pay attention. Hear this. Are you part of God's people, Israel? Hear this. Listen, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Faithful Jews would recite this daily. But notice where Moses goes next. You shall love the Lord, your God, with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might. Love is where Moses starts. First, listen. Second, love. This command sounds familiar to most of us because Jesus later identified this as the greatest command. Notice what Moses doesn't say. He doesn't say, know the Lord. Know the Lord with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your might. Though knowledge of the Lord is very important, and Paul prays for God's people to have that over and over again. Knowledge is important, but that's not what Moses says. Moses doesn't say, fear the Lord with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your might. Though reverence is important, he says love. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. Moses knows every human life is organized around what it loves most. That's what your life is organized around, what you love the most. We may think the greatest threat to faithfulness is ignorance. Like if people just knew more, if people would hear us out, if people had more of the evidence, then faithfulness would follow. But Israel, their history is proving otherwise. The generation that died in the wilderness had plenty of evidence. They saw the sea open and they saw manna every morning. They saw Sinai shake. Information wasn't their problem. Their problem was within their heart. And Moses knows that this next generation he's preaching to is going to face the same challenge because every generation does. What strikes me is that Moses doesn't simply call them to know the Lord. He calls them to love the Lord with everything they have. What Moses fears is their loss of affection, that they're going to lose their affection towards the God who is giving them these blessings. I think people rarely drift from God intellectually first. I think most often we drift from God affectionately first, and then our mind starts raising the objections. The relationship weakens before our theology changes. And Moses knows that. Moses knows the question isn't like, what are we going to love? What are we going to organize our life around? The question is, what are we loving most? Because that's what we're organizing all of our life and all of our relationships around. Something will become the organizing center of our life. And Moses says right at the front of this, that position, that throne of your heart belongs to God. So love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. Not because God needs our affection, but because what we love ultimately directs where we go. And then Moses says something remarkable. These words shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk about them when you sit down in your house. You should talk about them when you're walking by the way. You should talk about them when you're lying down. You should be talking about them when you're getting up. And notice what he's describing, not a worship service. He's describing a culture, like a way of life. Faith is not confined to like this hour during our week. Faith is shaping ordinary conversations at the dinner table, along the road, before bed, first thing in the morning. Moses is describing a people whose lives are saturated with the reality of God. And it's because he understands that whatever a generation stops talking about may eventually become forgotten. And forgotten things don't stay precious for very long. Family historians understand this. There's names in your family trees and in mine, names that were once spoken constantly around the dinner table. Stories from our family trees that everyone knew. Sacrifices that shaped our entire family And by the third or the fourth generation removed, it's hard to recall their name. And it's not because they weren't important, it's because nobody kept telling their story. Memory survives through repetition. And silence is often that first stage of forgetting. And so Moses starts painting us a picture, and it's a dangerous picture. Beginning in verse 10, this is what's waiting for Israel. And it's a dangerous, dangerous picture. It's good and great cities that they didn't build. Houses full of good things, but they didn't fill that house. Wells they didn't dig, vineyards they didn't plant, olive trees they didn't cultivate. Can you imagine after 40 years or decades of wandering in the wilderness, and finally everything that we've known is becoming temporary? Tent life, daily dependence, constant moving, all that is coming to an end. And now God is handing us stability. The dream, like finally arriving. We've made it. We've made it. We've arrived. And right in the middle of that dream comes this warning. Beware. Watch yourself. Take care, lest you forget the Lord. There it is. Like that's what Moses fears. Take care, lest you forget. Forgetfulness is what Moses is most concerned about. Not atheism, not even idolatry initially. It's forgetfulness. And it's important to define this in Deuteronomy. Because in Deuteronomy, forgetting is not memory loss. Like this generation is not going to wake up one morning unable to recall the details of the Exodus event. They're not going to forget about Pharaoh. They're not going to forget about Moses and the plagues. Like not in the sense of like being unable to recall that it happened. To forget in Deuteronomy means to stop living as though God is the reason for everything. That's what forgetting is in Deuteronomy. Forgetting is to stop living as though God is the reason for everything in your life. It means his reality is no longer shaping my decisions. It doesn't mean I no longer can recall the details of God's story, but it's me choosing not to live within it anymore. That's why prosperity can be so dangerous, because prosperity hides our dependence. A person standing in the desert that's thirsty, they know they're in need, and they depend on something outside of themselves. But what happens when you stand next to a full refrigerator? I think we can begin to believe that we don't really need anything. Nobody walks through the desert for years, for decades, and says, I don't need God. Need's obvious when you're in those wilderness seasons, but success can create illusions. When the crops grow and the bank account increases and the business expands and the retirement account accumulates and our family starts to thrive, we can begin, without realizing it, to attribute all of this success to our own competence. It's dangerous. It's a dangerous place to be. Moses understands that gratitude requires intentional memory. Intentional memory. Remember, remember, remember. Otherwise, our blessings become ordinary. And what becomes ordinary is often taken for granted. The danger is not that God's people will stop receiving blessings. The danger is that God's people will stop seeing those blessings as blessings from God. The danger isn't the wealth itself. It's the illusion that wealth creates. This illusion that I'm self-sufficient, that I've got here by my own competence, that God may be helpful, but he's not really like necessary first thing in the morning. And Moses anticipates a future conversation. Happy Father's Day. That's what I was forgetting. Happy Father's Day to all you dads. This is for you all. Moses anticipates a future conversation. A child asking why. Why? Why these commands? Why this way of life? Why this covenant? Why this God? And it's one of the most important questions I think this chapter raises. But what Moses assumes is that God's people are very good at telling the story. Moses assumes faithful followers of God are like professionals at telling this story of redemption and grace and salvation. Moses doesn't say, when your child asks why, say, because I said so. Moses says, when your child asks why, tell them about Egypt. Tell them about slavery. Tell them about deliverance. Tell them about redemption. Tell them about grace. The foundation of obedience is not law, it's redemption. Israel obeys because God has rescued them. The church obeys because Christ has rescued us. One generation can't just assume the next generation understands this story. We must intentionally hand it down. And Moses says, be ready, because that day's coming when you're asked why. We have to pass it down as testimony, as our deliverance, our redemption, God's grace in our life. We have to hand it down as lived experience of our slavery and our freedom from it. Children need to hear of God's faithfulness in our lives, God's answered prayers, God's providential care, God's transformation in our life, God's grace. And every generation is responsible for introducing the next generation to the God who's rescued us. And Moses sees it coming from a mile away. Sometimes we can read these commands and think primarily about obedience, but underneath of it all is love. Love the Lord your God. So this chapter repeatedly spoke about loving God. And now chapter 7 is going to talk about removing rival allegiances. Every covenant relationship requires exclusivity. Every covenant relationship requires exclusivity. God's not just worried about removing the statues from their life, though, at times, definitely, that's part of it. But God's also concerned about removing competitors, removing things that are vying for our affections, things that might slowly cause us to replace God with something else. Love always refuses rivals. And this language can sound harsh, I think, to modern ears. We hear words like exclusivity and think of restriction. But every meaningful relationship operates this way. Everyone. A marriage covenant is exclusive. And it's not because our love is insecure, but because our love is so committed. When someone tells their wife or their husband, you are the only one I choose. For the rest of my life, I choose you to have and to hold as long as we both shall live. I don't think we hear oppression when somebody makes that covenant. I think we hear devotion. Like, what? Love. That is going to be exclusively the person for you as long as you both shall live. Covenant love always creates boundaries around rival affections. And God's not asking for Israel to do something he himself refuses to do. He's already bound himself to them. He's protected them. He's provided for them. This exclusivity that God demands is rooted in his faithful covenant, in his covenant faithfulness that he's been demonstrating over and over for his people. And so if chapter 6 and chapter 7 are important, which they are, chapter 8 might be like the heart of what all this is building to. This key word appears over and over throughout this section. Remember, remember, remember. And the opposite side of that coin. Don't forget. Don't forget. He tells them to remember. And he tells them to remember again the wilderness. Remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. He tells them to remember the wilderness again. How many times, Moses, are you going to hang this over our heads forever? How many times are you going to bring up the details of the wilderness? I've told you this before. Personally, I would rather forget those difficult seasons, like those wilderness wanderings of my personal life. I would rather move past them, put that all behind me, close that chapter. Moses says, don't do that. Moses says, remember it. Remember the hunger. Remember the uncertainty. Remember your dependence. Remember the manna. Moses wants us to remember the wilderness, and not because the suffering was pleasant, but because the suffering revealed important truths about ourselves and about who God is. The Lord humbled you. The Lord tested you. the Lord fed you. There were things that they learned in the wilderness that prosperity would never, ever teach them. The wilderness stripped away all their illusions. There's no stockpiles. There's no backup plans. There's no economic system to depend on. There's no infrastructure. It's just every day they're confronted with this reality. If God's not here, we don't survive. If God doesn't show up, if God's not in this with us, it's over. This is all over. Well, nobody volunteers for those wilderness seasons. Those seasons often reveal truths that abundance hides. It's often during those difficult seasons that we discover just how much of our life we never really had control of in the first place. The wilderness exposes our dependence. And dependence, while uncomfortable, is where faith grows the strongest. The wilderness taught them that every day of your life is a gift. The wilderness taught them that every meal, every single meal, every drop of water comes from God. The wilderness taught them that human beings are incredibly dependent creatures, though we like to pride ourselves on our independence. The wilderness taught them trust. And Moses is worried that all of this abundance that they're about to receive is going to erase all of those lessons. And then comes one of the most penetrating verses of the book. Beware, lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. Notice where the danger begins. It's in our heart. Before this is ever spoken, before this is ever acted on, before anyone else sees it, there's this shift internally. The story has now changed. God moves from the center of our story to the margins, and ourself moves into the spotlight. Notice, Israel's not denying God's existence. What they're doing is taking credit for what God provided. That's how pride usually works. It works through misplaced attribution. We quietly move God from the center of the story to the margins of the story and place ourselves there in the middle instead. Look what I built. Look what I've earned. Look what I've accomplished. Look what I've achieved. And Moses says, beware, beware. Because the moment you start telling that story, you've forgotten something. You've forgotten the one who gave you any ability at all to do any of it. If prosperity creates pride, Moses knows exactly how to combat it. And he tells us in chapter 9, remember grace. Remember grace. Because forgotten grace always becomes earned righteousness. Nothing kills pride faster than remembering God's grace. Israel is about to conquer nations stronger and mightier than themselves. And the temptation is going to be obvious. We must be pretty special. God must really, really think we're special and deserving. And Moses crushes that idea immediately. It's not because of your righteousness. It's not because of your righteousness. It's not because of your righteousness. He says it 3 times. He's relentless about this. Moses knows what can happen. Victory can make us feel important. Success can make us feel deserving. Blessing can make us feel superior. And so before they cross the Jordan, Moses says, let's clear this up. This is not because of your righteousness. Imagine hearing this sermon. You're standing on the edge of receiving everything your parents longed for. You're finally entering the land. And Moses looks at us and says, before you take a single step across that Jordan River, let's make one thing absolutely clear. You're not entering because you earned it. You're not entering because you're impressive. You're not entering because God looked across this earth and found the most deserving people available. You're entering because God made a promise. And God keeps his promises. The foundation beneath Israel's future is not their performance. It's God's. It's God's faithfulness. And what a thing to say before entering this land. It's not because you're righteous. It's not because you're better than your parents' generation. It's not because you're any more deserving or any more morally superior. In fact, what Moses does is remind them about the golden calf. And if I were giving this pep talk before entering Canaan, that's not where I would go. I'd talk about courage and strength and opportunity and momentum. Moses says, let's talk about that time we worshiped a calf made of gold. What was lost that day wasn't like just their obedience. What they lost that day was sight of God. They lost their sight of God. So why does Moses say, let's talk about it? Let's talk about that time we made a golden calf. It's because nothing protects the human heart from pride quite like remembering God's grace. The moment we start believing we deserve these blessings, we deserve this inheritance, that's the moment we start losing everything Moses is trying to preserve. The church doesn't stand where it stands because of our righteousness. We don't belong to Christ because we earned his grace. We're here because God's merciful. That's the only reason we stand where we stand, is because God is a God of mercy. The moment we forget that, we're vulnerable. But if that reality remains clear to us, pride will struggle to survive. We have to remember God's grace. Which brings us back to the museum, back to the wedding ring and the photograph and the stuffed animal. Those precious things that slipped away. Imagine walking through that museum, looking at the shelves of all these things that once really mattered to someone. Objects that people thought they would never lose. And then wondering how it happened, like how it got here in this museum of the precious lost things. How can something so precious become forgotten? Moses is standing before Israel, standing before us, preaching to us, asking us to consider this same question, and not about a ring or a photograph, but about this treasured possession, and the possession is God. God himself, a relationship with our Creator. People rarely lose valuable things on purpose. Usually we become distracted and busy and preoccupied and comfortable, and slowly this precious thing drifts out of our grasp. And then time goes by where we don't even notice that it's gone. Moses stands on the plains of Moab looking at this generation that's about to receive everything their parents longed for, and his concern is not they'll lose the land. His concern is they'll gain the land, the inheritance, all the blessing, and lose the Lord. And if that happens, they've lost the most precious thing they were ever given, a relationship with their Creator. That's why this message to them is so simple. Remember, remember the one who brought you here. Remember the one who sustained you throughout your entire life. Remember the one who's rescued you from slavery. Remember the one who's blessed you and promised you inheritance. Remember the Lord. The greatest danger facing God's people is not always adversity. Sometimes it is abundance. And the only safeguard against that danger is a heart that never forgets where every good gift comes from. The wilderness generation, they forgot God's faithfulness and they trusted their fears. And so this next generation, they have a different danger in front of them. Their danger is forgetting God's faithfulness and trusting their success. One generation struggled with adversity, and the next is going to struggle with prosperity. And Moses understands that prosperity can be every bit as spiritually dangerous as suffering, maybe even more so. Suffering does remind us that we need God. Prosperity tempts us to believe we don't. So that's why Moses keeps returning to that same command. Remember the wilderness. Remember your redemption. Remember the covenant our God has made with us. Remember the Lord. The church gathers every week for that reason, among many reasons, but that is like central to what we do. We remember the cross. We remember the open tomb. We remember the grace that has found us and called us into God's family. And in remembering him week after week, we learn once again how to live faithfully with God in this land full of blessing. We're going to stand and sing. And if there's anything we can do to help you in your spiritual walk, if there's any way we can help you, let one of the shepherds, let somebody know before you leave here today, if there's anything at all we can do to help you in your walk with Jesus Christ. Kirby, let's sing and sing.